Welcome classic rock fans to another one of my worst to best, and today we're looking at the albums of Roxy music. I will preface this video of course by stating that these are my own personal rankings and opinions which may well differ from yours. We all have different opinions about music, but I'd be interested in how you would rank these albums. Please leave your comments in the boxes below. Number 8 is Manifesto from 1979. There's certainly no denying that this record is just that. It's a manifesto for a kind of a new direction that this band were heading in. Of course, this album spawns the wonderful Angel Eyes and Dance Away, and there's no denying that it has an accessible pop gloss shimmer to it, very much a sound that would define the final 3 Roxy albums. If we take an album like Stranded, for example, it's a really interesting record. It's interesting for me because it extrapolates a lot of those brooding art rock sensibilities from the first album, but it also starts to explore more mainstream sonic possibilities. I mean, you could argue this band were beginning to forge a new manifesto as soon as Eno departs. To me, this feels like an attempt to fashion a studio rock album steeped in disco. And you can understand it in many respects. When this band emerged from their hiatus, they're confronted with a landscape, a topography scarred by the spit and nihilism of punk on one side, and a nation writhing from the effects of Saturday Night Fever on the other. It has to be said that one of my favourite songs on this album is Dance Away. It's probably everybody's favourite to some extent. But it's just the lyrics are absolutely sublime. I mean, lines like, you're dressed to kill and guess who's dying. Loneliness is a crowded room full of open hearts turned to stone. I mean, it's pretty stirring stuff. For many, this record anticipates that pop montage of the 1980s. And despite its ambition, it's an album that I've never warmed to despite repeated listens. It's... I think the manifesto was very clear on this one. It's very much we're not the band that we were. Unfortunately, the band that they were was the band that I fell in love with. So, number 8 is Manifesto from 1979. Number 7 is Flesh and Blood from 1980. There's no doubt that this album was a huge success. You've only got to look at the album sales to see that. And of course that band continued to explore these very ambient textures. In fact, on this one they positively luxuriate in them. However, this album does contain the artistic heresy that is the smooth rendering of the Birds at 8 Miles High, stripped of all its psychedelic edginess. It has to be said, of course, this album has some fine moments. Ferry's voice, of course, is always a fine moment on a Roxy music album. And the 3 singles, of course, are worth noting. The yearning love song, Over You, and the very melodramatic Oh Yeah on the Radio, which is a sublime number. It's one that has a mellow drifting feel that foreshadows the atmospheric pop, of course, explored on their next album, Avalon. Interestingly, of course, a lot of those 80s bands cite the song Same Old Scene as being a huge influence. Bands like Duran Duran, ABC, and some of those other 80s bands to boot. Number 6 is Country Life from 1974. Now, this might be a controversial choice for some Roxy music fans, but for me, no doubt it still contains some of that wonderful sonic edginess that we got on those first 2 albums. But for me, it's just not as good. It doesn't quite live up to those 2 albums, especially the second one. The lyrics, of course, are really interesting on this one, and Ferry croons about love and regret and decadence, of course, all in equal measure. And a call has to go out to the wonderful Eddie Jobson on this album. I think Eddie Jobson is remarkable. I remember him, of course, when he used to play with Tull with that beautiful glass violin of his. One of the songs I really like on this album, which might actually take some people by surprise, is the song Prairie Rose. That's a frothy quality to it, and I don't mean that as a pejorative. I do genuinely like this song. If I'm not mistaken, this is the band's breakthrough album in the USA. It's also the album that got them into hot water due to the revealing nature of the album sleeve. This album, of course, has some sublime moments. I love the shuffling boogie of If It Takes All Night. I like the aforementioned Prairie Rose, of course. But if I had to underline, I think the album's best moments, I'd have to go with the thrill of it all. The drama, the composition and the tonal quality is just fabulous overall. Number 5 is Avalon from 1982. This album is a popular album of Roxy music fans, and I'm certainly mindful of that. But whenever I listen to certainly the later records, I do find myself looking back at the edgier, earlier Roxy stuff that was so bizarre and thrilling. More Than This is certainly a devastatingly beautiful song and used so effectively in the film Lost in Translation. But also tracks like While My Heart Is Still Beating has a languid, drifting quality which I really enjoy. One of my favourite songs on this album is Take a Chance With Me. The chorus is as infectious as a dose of the clap. I find myself putting this song on repeat and listening to it over and over again. I absolutely adore it. This album was described by Rolling Stone magazine as a distillation of vampiric endurance, and I have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. I will say that this album has a cinematic quality that has the listener drifting away on waves and waves of beguiling ambient sound. It has a hypnotic quality, and it's a great album. There's no doubt you listen to those last few albums that Roxy Music have mellowed. They sound more wistful, a far cry from those earlier pop art explorations of old. Number 4 is Siren from 1975. This is the one with the pulsating Love is a Drug. It's a wonderful rock-funk fusion with enough twists and throbs to keep us all interested. In my opinion, this is an underrated album. It has been lauded by numerous critics. Rolling Stone magazine has said that Ferry on this one doesn't oversing. I'm not really aware of him oversinging anywhere, to be honest with you. But obviously the days of that avant-garde experimentation and pop art fusion are long gone. Instead, we get a slick recolouring in deep funk R&B tones. For me, the standout numbers on this are She Sells and Could It Happen to Me. These are numbers I really enjoy on this album. I have to admit my favourite track on this album is Nightingale. It's a dark, intriguing number where Ferry listens to the voice of a nightingale and mistakes it for the voices of women. It's certainly an interesting one, if not a little bit deranged. This album is a fusion of smooth artistic pop, danceable rhythms and dramatic balladry. And of course, let's not forget the cover featuring a very young Jerry Hall. Oh, those pre-Mick years, eh? Number 3 is Roxy Music from 1972. This is a remarkable album. It's been described by one critic as a dissident blow against rock's anti-fashion stance, cutting through the stale dope smoke fug of the hippie hangover. Roxy at this time with the embodiment of musical decadence, or postmodernist pastiche if you like. They're served up in waves of guitar, brass, synths, and of course mascara. This is a piece of pop art made flesh. In many ways this anticipates the glamour and stylings of the post-punk new romantic period. If we think about the topography of the musical landscape when this album came out, it was quite a drab affair in many respects. We had the Delta blues imitators, we had the navel gazing of lots of singer-songwriter troubadours, country rock was still very much in full swing, and then of course we get those prog virtuosos that were certainly more interested in long, meandering, complex pieces than glamour and glitz. In fact, Phil Manzanera says at this point everything went flat. It has to be noted, of course, that this album does boast perhaps the best Roxy song ever, and that is If There Is Something. Of course, this is a song that's used devastatingly in the film Flashbacks of a Fool. On this one, of course, Eno's electronic noodling and atmospherics fitting perfectly with the overall vibe of the album, fitting in seamlessly with the record's tone and futuristic feel. A sonic tapestry of strange ethereal wizardry and wordplay. A pop art hodgepodge of rock and roll, crooning, quaint balladeering, sci-fi and 1980s doo-wop. All presented in a kind of Andy Warhol montage, over which somebody's vomited copious amounts of glitter, by the way. I can't help but feel that this album isn't particularly sequenced that well and suffers a little bit from not particularly great production. At times it feels like a glam re-rendering of the Velvet Underground with its use of dissonant tonal qualities. We get oboes and electric guitars all sort of playing off each other. It's certainly experimental stuff. It's not quite Bitches Brew, of course, but it's a challenging listen nonetheless. Number 2 is Stranded from 1973. It's about this time, of course, that Rolling Stone described Brian Ferry as, I quote, the most disquieting baritone in pop. And personally, I think that apart from the clever wordplay that you usually get with Roxy songs, and that's certainly here in abundance on this album, I think Brian Ferry exudes a kind of a renewed confidence on this album in the way he sings. Of course, this is the Eno-less album. This is the album that's made after Brian Eno departs. And bearing that in mind, of course, I think this album had to be good. It had to be a real statement of intent. And of course, we must doff our caps once more to the brilliant Eddie Jobson. I think what he adds to this album is remarkable. I love the synth textures on this one. I mean, the street life and the recreating of the traffic noises is absolute genius. This album is littered with gems. I mean, you get the wonderful melodramatic Song for Europe and the absolute gorgeous Mother of Pearl, of course. It's inventive, it's flamboyant, You know, and although the album title is Stranded, it seems ironically that they, as a band, they are anything but. In fact, even Brian Eno has gone on to say this is his favourite Roxy album. Certainly you can argue that this album isn't as experimental as the first two. It's a much more structured romp. It positively exhales amid the breathlessness of the compositions as Ferry weaves and warbles his way through the songs. One of the standout tracks is the aforementioned Mother of Pearl that unwinds like a tortured declaration of love. And Psalm, of course, is also another favourite of mine. It's absolutely beautiful, augmented, of course, by the lovely keyboard parts of Eddie Jobson. And number one is For Your Pleasure from 1973. I love this album with its dark shades and tones. It's a beautiful piece of pop art soundscaping. I think on this one we see Ferry as an anticipator of new romanticism and nightlife voyeur all rolled into one. This album is littered with gems. Of course, we get the wonderful song To a Fictional Dance, Do the Strand, the beautiful Beauty Queen, not to mention the rather odd In Every Dream Home a Heartache, a strange ode to those undercounter inflatables. The sound is dark and tortured on this record, with Ferry writhing away like some Dionysian figure, all mascara and leather, and that wonderful staccato voice of his beautifully framing his deranged musings. He's certainly not the romantic crooner that he would become for the later albums. Interestingly, of course, we get the voice of Dame Judi Dench on this record, so you could say it's an album that has something for everybody. This record is a kaleidoscopic mishmash of deranged shades that critique fashion, glamour, sex, amid the melancholy of Ferry's phrasing and, of course, Eno's wonderful synth textures. Ever since that wonderful barbaric yop of Little Richard, a manifesto has been forged around a commitment for rock and roll to be a violent rearrangement of the senses. I think it's fair to say on these first two albums, Roxy Music are certainly committed to that. And during this time, this band hold that flame up higher than a lot of their contemporaries, effectively illuminating the darker and duller passages of the 1970s. So there you have it. My favourite Roxy album is For Your Pleasure from 1973. Anyway, you've been watching an episode of Worst the Best. If you enjoy my musings on music, please do click like, subscribe and click that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. And do check out the Facebook page. I put loads of stuff on there every day. If you're interested in extra content or supporting the work that I do here, please think about checking out my Patreon. Now, appearing up here should be two videos that I think you'd be really interested in. Please do check those out. Other than that, please stay safe and do keep listening.